Sister Eileen Rice, O.P., entered the Adrian Dominican congregation in Michigan in the early 60s. She received her BA and MA in mathematics and taught in the elementary schools in Michigan for 4 years and was principal of a Catholic academy for 2 more. In 1972, she joined the faculty of Siena Heights College in Adrian, Michigan. During that time, she studied for her PhD in education from the University of Michigan. She received that degree in 1977. In 1978, she was promoted to Assistant Professor of Education and named Director of Teacher Education at Siena Heights. She stayed there at her own request without promotion until her untimely death in January 1994. She was 49 years old. In this documentary, shot on the Siena Heights campus 2 months before her death, we'll meet Sister Eileen and hear her views on teaching and learning, undergraduate education, living the good life, and facing death. We'll also meet her teachers and colleagues, her present and former students, and learn from them about this unique individual, Eileen K. Rice, truly a teacher who changed lives.
The fact that I don't have real long to live doesn't really make a difference in what I do on a day-to-day basis. I've always been somebody who had a real strong sense of living each day to its fullest. For years, when I get up in the morning, the first thought that goes through my head is that I thank God for the gift of that particular day, and I ask His help in making the whole day a gift back to Him again. And I've just always said that, for years and years. And so I suppose I'm kind of present-oriented in that sense. Frankly, I drive so much, I drive about 2,500 miles a month, that in some ways my chances of being creamed by a semi are greater than dying of cancer. And so I've always had this sense that life is a little bit tenuous.
Sister Eileen, you're known far beyond Siena Heights College these days as an inspired teacher. What advice would you give new teachers as they begin their careers?
Probably the simplest advice would be to keep on learning. I think teaching doesn't work if we don't learn. And sometimes we get kind of caught up in the teaching process and forget that learning is a lot more important than teaching. I train student teachers, as you know, and I know that they have crossed a really important bridge when they stop talking to me about how they're going to teach and they start talking to me about how their students are going to learn. And so I think it's absolutely critical to keep learning, because that's what keeps it new and alive inside us. I mean, we know when we're listening to somebody teach, whether they like what they're teaching, whether they care about it, whether it matters to them. And those 3 things usually depend on whether the person is still learning things about what it is they're teaching. When somebody kind of shuts down inside and stops caring and stops learning, the students know immediately. They know they're an audience. They're not a learning community anymore. And so I guess my sense is that if we can remember that the most important part of teaching is learning, I won't say that we've got it made, but at least we've got ourselves focused in the right direction. I always answer my telephone here, teaching, learning, Sister Eileen. And it's not an accident that I use both words, because they're both critical to the process. In fact, I'd argue that between the two, learning is much more important than teaching. And if I had to pick one or the other, I'd always choose to learn rather than to teach.
How do you as a teacher see Sister Eileen as a teacher?
The master teacher.
Okay.
Eileen is the master teacher.
She is a teacher of all teachers. Every class I walk out going, wow. And the things that she does is she takes whatever she's teaching, it doesn't matter what subject it is, and she makes every person sit back and say, they don't know they're doing this, but they sit back and say, how is this affecting me? Why do I have to learn this? And what she does is for every person that's in her class, she makes that person take ownership. It's not her teaching, it's helping us learn the material. So when people say she's a teacher, she is a teacher, but she's more of a guider and an educator and a person who challenges us to learn.
Her love for education definitely rubs off on her students.
She has the ability to teach to where you want to do for her, just to pay her back for what she has given to you in the classroom.
What led you to choose a career in teaching?
Well, the short answer is I was going to be a nun. I was going to be an Adrian Dominican. The Adrian Dominicans teach, ergo I'm a teacher. And literally that was it. Now, the fact was teaching was also real attractive to me. I'd always enjoyed school. It was a lot of fun. I was the oldest of 10 kids. You played school all the time at home. So it really was kind of a very, very just kind of natural decision. It kind of came with the territory in the early 60s when I entered the congregation. At that point, I think we could count on one hand the number, or maybe two hands, the number of nurses we had in the congregation. On one hand, the number of social workers we had. And maybe on three hands, the number of other people who were not teachers, nurses, or social workers. And that's of a group of almost 2,000 women. And so essentially we were a teaching congregation. Now I discovered, once I had a chance to teach, that I liked it. I was good at it. I enjoyed doing it. So I think it's one of those just kind of, felicitous, serendipitous type of things that happened to work very, very well for me. Because even when we changed as a congregation and gave individual women a lot more options about what they did with their time, it never even occurred to me not to teach. Not to be part of an educational institution and the educational endeavor. It's in my blood, I think. It's part of who I am.
Eileen is simply an extraordinary person. And part of her extraordinary nature is the fact that she is blessed with an amazing abundance, a superabundance of energy. She never quits. She is what the students call the bionic nun. And she is such a highly organized and demanding teacher that the students refer to her as Attila the Nun.
Attila the Nun. She may not have given that to herself. She just may not know. This may be true confessions time. She has this way of stating expectations in such a way that they are not options. And although they're usually reasonable for most superhumans, they tend to stretch those of us who are mere mortals just a bit. And the time when that usually becomes most apparent is at the beginning of every semester, when she hands out several calendars in the beginning of her courses. One calendar details what will be done in class each time the class meets. Fine, well enough. Traditional syllabus, although not very traditionally put together. And the third calendar is the what's due when. And the assignments are never ending. It is incredible, the amount of work. Now that's not all. For each assignment there is usually a handout done in very small type. For example, the one for the unit plan for the methods course went on for pages. It was nearly as long as the plan was that I eventually put together, the directions for how to do it. But they're very, very precise. And they're not stifling. There's plenty of room for creativity, but there are clear standards set, and they're very difficult to meet. So that is, the Attila comes in because there is no negotiating what those standards will be. One may negotiate how to go about meeting them. One may negotiate even about due dates. She was always very good when I was enrolled in her classes about understanding things like when my son dumped my file off my disk right before I was ready to print something. And I called her, oh, I can't turn it in. No big deal. Have it for me tomorrow. So I stayed up most of the night and typed it, and she eventually got it. But it's the kind of thing where I have always gotten the impression that while I may negotiate with Eileen the person, Eileen the teacher is very rarely to be diluted down in terms of her standards and expectations.
One of the things I really value about her is that she demands excellence. But even though she demands it, you can take it.
And I think that what's happened here in the time that Eileen has been here is that the institution has been extraordinarily supportive of the things that Eileen is about as a teacher, as a person, as an intellectual. There's a lot of talented people here, talented people who are interested in undergraduate teaching and advising, graduate teaching and advising, people who really can support her and interact with her and create an environment in which she can flourish. The things that she's about as a teacher, inspiring students, working with faculty, whether they be our faculty, other faculty, in terms of professional development. This has just been an atmosphere filled with the notion that one of the fundamental things that educational institutions are about are human growth and development. So she finds herself in a collegial environment where her deepest interests and beliefs and abilities are surrounded by an atmosphere that fosters the particular gifts that she has.
She always has good contributions to make. She's very positive. In other words, even if she wants things changed, it's not because something before wasn't good, but it's because this new thing might be better.
I see.
You know, some people tear down in order to build up. I think Eileen builds on things that are already there.
Eileen sees potential in me that I never ever really saw myself. And she brings that out of me in that loving, gentle, nurturing kind of way.
She turns things into positives, is able to transform individuals. Like I talked to her once before and shared with her that she reminded me of Native Americans use a great deal of spirituality and symbolisms. She reminded me of the spirit of a butterfly, in the sense that she has the ability to transform individuals into the beautiful, I think, most qualitative individual they can be.
Sometime I'm going to ask her my secret question. What did she find difficult about teaching? She always makes it look so easy, so, it just flows. But somewhere there has to be, behind this unenergized and masked performance, something that's difficult, that she doesn't let other people see. And I always wondered what it was.
Now,
I'm going to find out. I intend to.
The thing that has really impressed me with Sister Eileen is that she makes teaching a profession. It's also her ministry. And watching her as a teacher causes me to have pride in the decision that I've chosen to be a teacher, and that I am a professional as an educator. And having seen her style of teaching and her level of commitment and dedication just causes me to be very proud that I've chosen education as my career.
Well, that's great. Well, give me an example of something that she does that makes you feel that she's so excellent. She's a teacher of teachers. What would be something that she does, or something that she is, perhaps, that gives you that feeling?
Well, what's really touched my life is the fact that Sister Eileen has a way of zeroing in on all our positive traits, and she's very quick to point that out to us. And in a lot of her classes, we have to do a lot of writing papers and do research. And as she critiques our papers, she always is very quick to tell us what we've done right, or what is creative, or points that we've shown that are excellent. And often throughout my paper she has smile faces or has the word excellent. But she also lets me know in areas that are weak. And a couple times I've used a word wrongly in a sentence, and she'll put a smile face by it and say, oops. Or she'll have a way of saying, well, maybe you need to word this differently. So she has a wonderful way of balancing constructive criticism with positive praise.
Oh, that's super, and that's a very good example. I was interested that you used the word teaching is her ministry. Could you just amplify that a bit? What do you mean that teaching is her ministry?
Well, a person who's in the ministry dedicates their whole life to it. It's not something they do 8 hours a day, but their whole life is centered around their ministry. And with Sister Eileen, teaching in her life is the ministry. It's her total commitment. She never stops teaching. Even when she's away from the classrooms, she still takes on the role as teacher.
Eileen, you've been a mentor for scores of student teachers and other undergraduates. What are the most important lessons you hope they've learned from you?
I hope that they've learned that it's important to enjoy what you do. There's almost nothing someone can do with his or her life that is worth doing if it doesn't give them life, if it doesn't give them a cause for joy, if it doesn't give them a reason to wake up in the morning, if it doesn't give them a sense of connectedness with who they are as a person. The people with whom I work, of course, work very hard. Teaching is a very stressful job. It's the kind of thing that takes a great deal out of you. And I think that if those who teach don't understand that there always has to be something going back inside, there has to be something that kind of supports who they are inside, then it doesn't work. Teaching becomes just another job. You might as well punch in the time clock, as you go. And one of the things that's always been real important to me is the fact that I absolutely love what I do. I say to students all the time, it's not a matter of working hard or having fun. It's working hard and having fun. And so they hand me 40 papers, and I come grinning into class 48 hours later, with the papers all checked. That's the nature of the beast. And so it's really important to me that whatever it is they do, whether they stay in teaching or not, that activity, that life activity, be life-giving for them. But somehow it keeps them alive inside. It stays in touch with the core of who they are as a person. Because if we lose touch with that, we've literally lost it. And that's a sacrifice not worth making.
Right.
And so that's probably the most important thing I hope they understood.
I think of Robert Frost's line, where work is play for mortal stakes.
Yes, exactly.
The true profession.
Yeah.
When you're doing it right. Just a follow-on question, which really relates to what you've just said. One of your students said, well, for Sister Eileen, teaching isn't simply a job, certainly not a job. It isn't even a profession. It's her ministry. How do you comment on that?
I think that's probably true. Ministry for me has always been much more about being than doing. In our congregation, in fact, we've talked about that a lot, because the usual conception of ministry is what you do. In fact, I used to chuckle when I was a graduate student at University of Michigan, wearing the habit, yet. My students, my fellow students, my colleagues there would say to me, now, sister, and they would say that, look at me in the habit, now, sister, after you finish being a graduate student here, are you going to go back to being a nun? And I was like, what? But it was a real clear sense to them that being a nun was something you did, not someone you were, not part of your being. And I always reflected on that, because in our congregation, we've had many conversations about the importance of the ministry of being. The artists in our congregation have been the best to help us understand that they minister by who they are, not so much by what they do. They've helped us understand that product is not the important thing, that having an official job title is not the important thing, that who we are is what matters most. And so when I think about what the students said, yeah, that makes sense to me, because teaching for me is more than a job or profession. It is who I am, it's my being. And since being is ministry, by definition, I would absolutely agree with that. Absolutely agree with that. They tease me because when I answer the phone, I say teaching, learning, Sister Eileen. And that makes sense to me, because those two present participles have a lot to do with who I am as a person.
Like the clerk of Oxenford, gladly would he learn and gladly teach.
Yes.
And the other thing I thought of from the other side of the world, the Javanese of Indonesia have a wonderful proverb. They say, carpenters can't make tables better than themselves.
Ooh, yes.
Maybe,
yes.
Maybe you're a carpenter who's made many amazing tables, and I think along the way helped create some wonderful carpenters.
There. Well, that's probably the most important thing, isn't it? It's not the tables I make, but the carpenters.
Yep.
Yes, because that's what goes into the future. The carpenters are much more important than the tables.
And we both remember who was a carpenter.
Exactly, exactly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would you talk a little about your vocations? First, what was your path to becoming a Dominican sister?
That's interesting. When I was in school in the 50s and 60s, it was very common for the nuns, these were real nuns in real habits, it was very common for the nuns to say, pray to God and ask him what he wants you to do with your life. Now, I was always a little perturbed at this because it didn't seem to give me an equal part in the process. But I was pretty virtuous, and so I prayed along and said, okay, God, what do you want me to do? And I do remember knowing very, very early, like maybe 5th or 6th grade, that what God wanted me to do was to be a nun. It was very clear to me. It was no big deal. In fact, I can remember being in the school library one day and thinking, oh my Lord, that's it. That's what I'm supposed to do. It took me another 6 years till I was a senior in high school to decide that that's what I wanted to do with my life. And I think that kind of coming to terms with the fact that it really was kind of a, not necessarily a negotiated agreement, but at least a joint agreement between the two of us, was a real important, time for me. Now, as I said a little earlier, I do know that it mattered to me that I had these wonderful role models of these nuns who had great minds and great senses of humor. And that the fact that they were around made it an attractive thing to do that. I mean, there are a lot of very personal reasons in terms of my own relationship with God why it made sense to do it. But it wasn't like I was being dragged kicking and screaming to the convent, sacrificing my life because this is what God wanted me to do. Nonsense. It was a very attractive kind of thing to do. And I think I kind of grew into the understanding of what a difference it made to me as a woman to have that kind of role. There was a long time, in fact still is, generally true now, when the only women, who were college presidents were nuns. The only women who were CEOs of big hospitals were nuns. And you could do things as a nun that you couldn't do, quote unquote, as a woman. We're fond of saying around here that Miriam Stimson, our graduate director, went to the University of Michigan in the 1940s, at a time when there was a quota on the number of women who were allowed in graduate programs in science. And nuns were not counted in that quota. And I mean, it's ironic in some ways, but on the other hand, it was very clear that we were a third gender. I know that when I went to the University of Michigan, for all practical purposes, they kept 3 roles: male, female, and nun. I was treated very differently than the other females in my program. I was in educational administration, which is typically a male field. And the women in that field were not taken seriously. I was. And I'm sure there are a lot of real interesting reasons for that, in terms of there wasn't a lot of, just because I was a nun, the whole kind of gender conflict thing, I wasn't, quote unquote, challenging, any male's place. But it was very clear. They took my mind seriously. They took my questions seriously. There was no doubt about it. In fact, one of our psych professors here years ago did her doctoral dissertation on the concept of androgyny with respect to nuns. Because our notion was that if androgyny really works, nuns were the perfect group to try it out with, because we were reinforced as females, typically, stereotypically, growing up. But once you're a nun, you're really reinforced for all the stereotypical male things, for being assertive, for having a mind, for taking a stand, for holding your own. And so what she did was took 2 religious congregations besides her own, a sample of them, took a control group of active Catholic laywomen, and got one of those monstrous adjective checklists, had us all go down and check, what we thought applied to us, of a list that clearly included both stereotypical male and stereotypical female terms. And as a matter of fact, the nuns were off the wall androgynous compared to their active Catholic lay counterparts. And so I think there's an interesting little piece in there that I know that at least subconsciously was very attractive to me, over and above kind of my personal sense of my relationship with God, and that this is kind of how he wanted me to spend my life.
Do you remember your very first encounter with Sister Eileen?
I was a member of the teacher training task force, which was an MEA subcommittee, and we were concerned with the quality of student teachers we were getting from both Adrian College and Siena Heights. And so Dwayne Winter, who was our UNICEF director, and myself came over to talk to Sister Eileen, and neither one of us, I don't think, had met her before. And I had grown up down the street from a Catholic school, and so my image of nuns were very scary people who floated across the street somehow magically. And I don't think I'd ever met a nun face-to-face before. And so when we came in, I think we were both a little bit in awe, and she referred to her fellow nuns as nunny bunnies, and the minute she didn't have the rest of it, we just kind of, okay. We kind of relaxed and could get to know her as a person.
I've
never had at least a conscious impression that she's a nun. I mean, we all know she's a nun, but she in no way wears her religion on her sleeve. I think rather than talking about Christianity and the message of the Dominicans, she simply lives it. She skips that step where you have to talk about it.
There are, of course, fewer and fewer women who are entering religious life. And so we, even at our congregation, talk about, will we be here in 50 years? Will we be here in 100 years? And frankly, it doesn't bother me whether we are or not. My sense is always that who we have been, has been a gift to the world and to ourselves. And who we will be in whatever form in the future will be a gift to the world and to ourselves. What I think has happened, which I find very, very interesting, is for a long time, religious orders were one of the places where women could exercise their sense of self in ways that they couldn't in other aspects of society. And interestingly, the decline in the numbers of women going into religious orders very closely paralleled the increase in the opportunities for women in general. And so I can't look at that, as a bad thing, as something that I have regrets over. Because what it's meant is that many of the things that in some ways, although it sounds ironic, because people talk about, going to the convent, cutting off other opportunities, many of the things that actually were opportunities for women in terms of becoming religious women now are available to them without that opportunity. I think that's wonderful because it broadens the actual opportunities for women, simply in general. And so the fact that that has a resulting decrease in the number of women who would choose to go to religious life has never been a point of panic for me or a point of concern. I'm not one of those folks who agonizes over the fact that in quote-unquote the old days 100 women a year would enter. And at this point, if a congregation gets between 5 and 10, they think they're having a great time. So my sense is that as we look toward the future, the most important thing is simply looking toward it with integrity and saying to ourselves, who are we and who do we want to be? And what do we need to do now to be who we are now and who we want to be? And that's going to involve a lot of questioning. It's going to involve not being frightened of the answers.
Right.
And then just, kind of, to be frank, kind of living with it, kind of being gentle with it, kind of just letting it happen, letting it unfold, and not, I don't know what I'm going to say, not getting caught up in a 10-year strategic plan of some kind. I guess I think life is not like that.
Probably in my 30-year experience with her, I've never heard her talk about what it's like to be a nun or an Adrian Dominican or a religious woman or a Christian. Those are just not subjects that I've ever heard her address or talk about. She lives it. And there's a sort of unwavering loyalty and sense of direction and focus in living out that vocation she chose a long time ago that comes across to me as never questioned. And I would never attribute that to naivete. As you say, I was a religious really for 27 years, and I can't remember, I meet Eileen here, how many years I spent with her. We lived at Oakwood together, and it was at the time that I raised a lot of questions about my own specific direction and how I would live out my commitment, and decided that I would begin to live it out some other way. And I lived with Eileen at the time I made that transition. She never talked about the transition either, what it was like for her. It was just like she was able to get below those things that were unessential, and just there was still an acceptance of my choice to live my commitment out in some other way. She didn't question hers, she didn't question mine. She was extremely supportive, but in no overt way. It's a very different, she does it uniquely in the Eileen style. And so she lives by her example. Direct, focused, one with depth, and not talked about, and that's, I think, all I can say.
I view Eileen as a religious role model. I would have to say that she probably exemplifies the characteristics that most religious people would want to have. She's a very charitable individual. She's kind. She's nurturing. Her center, her nucleus, if you will, is spiritual. And we use a person wheel frequently. Dr. Whitehead and his wife utilize a person wheel when we talk about an individual. And Eileen, for me, exemplifies the spiritual, the religious individual in the person wheel with the nucleus as her spirit, the spirituality, because everything revolves around her belief in God, her belief in a greater being. And that's very evident in everything that she does and carries herself. And so she lives her religiosity.
It's kind of funny because I never really look at her as a nun. I mean, you know, Sister Eileen, that type of thing, but that's probably as far as it goes. Every now and then she'll, you know, make a reference to the religion or her upbringing or something like that. But most of the time it's pretty much that we're here as students, and I don't think anyone that I know of has ever been put off like, oh, she's a Catholic nun, you know, that type of thing. She's a challenging teacher. She's an outstanding person, and that's, I think, what we focus on, not, you know, the religious part of it.
To the public, I feel that there's no doubt that Eileen is a religious. She is always Sister Eileen. Even though her students, for example, will call her familiarly as Eileen, she is still nonetheless a Dominican. That religious vocation, I think, plays out in her absolute dedication to her ministry, to teach, to educate educators, to teach and learn. I think, though, that Eileen is a very private person, and what she holds deeply, she holds close to her heart. And I think that her religious vocation and her spiritual life is something that she keeps very private.
I never remember Sister Eileen ever saying a word about Christianity or Catholicism or the church as such. But every day that I have worked with her, I have seen her be a Christian leader. She makes accurate moral decisions. She brings you along to know why she has thought the way she has. Every day that we work together, I can see her be a disciple in the way that she comes to her decisions and that the way she acts. Because you know we do more from her actions than from what she says.
The Valiant Companion is a code, if you will, that the Dominicans have lived by for a long time. And it's something that that my own grandmother grew up with. And when I think of the Valiant Companion, basically it's how to be. It talks about how to be and how to be a good person. And when I look at Eileen, I see the Valiant Companion. I see a person who only brings other people to good. I see a person who will go out of their way, regardless of the distance or the cost, to make something happen. I see someone who will bend over backwards to find a loophole so that they can help somebody out. I see someone who reaches out their hands to other people to gather them in. I see a person who you can call Eileen at 10, 11 o'clock at night and she's still in her office. She is amazing, the energy that woman has. I see a person who is very, very wise, who is very willing to listen, who is very willing to give counsel, who just is a very, very good, down-to-earth person. And those are some of the basic things that the Valiant Companion talks about. And whenever I read that, I think of Eileen, because that's who she is. That's who she is. And that's who she is, whether you're talking to her at 8 o'clock in the morning or whether you're talking to her at 11:30 at night on the phone.
That's who she is. Eileen sees the best in everyone. Eileen sees every one of us as that precious child of God made in his image. She is the epitome of justice and Christian honesty. She has a saying that she says all the time, and I'm not like she is where I can pull out, I don't know who said it, and I'm not going to say it exactly right, but she has a saying that she says about diversity and differences, and she says that differences are gifts to be cherished, not deficits to be corrected. And she sees everyone as special and unique and gifts to the world and to humanity. She's just a wonderful Christian example.
I think that if she wasn't here, she'd be an angel or a saint, because she has an aura of goodness around her, yet she's very down to earth, very humble, and loving and giving. And that's something that a lot of people can't achieve, or a lot of people don't even stop to think about it. But if I have problems, a lot of times I'll talk to her about them, because it may not be the answer to my problem, but somehow it gives me inner peace to realize that, as she explains to me, no, God's not deliberately doing this because I did something wrong. And she explains the reasons, and I feel better. So I trust her totally. And if I have a problem, I've talked to her about religion before and my doubts about certain things, and she's been there for me to explain them in a way that I can understand. Everybody has their jargon, and let's say a physician would have jargon that we don't understand, and I would think maybe a priest has the same. But Sister Eileen always keeps it down on a level that's communicated easily so people can understand.
I think in general, if you think of her as the kind of traditional nun that was shown in some of the movies, I don't think Adrian Dominicans by and large are that kind of nun. And Eileen is not that kind, even when she was fully dressed in a habit. She was expecting a lot of students, and I think she sees the Dominican tradition of to seek truth as kind of a core of where she's going. And I can't see just the traditional nun. I see a great deal of faith in her. But I don't see this faith in what even many traditional Roman Catholics would think a sister ought to be. I think she's much more creative than that.
Some people make a distinction between personal spirituality and conventional religiosity, or conventional religion. How do you advise people seeking greater meaning in their lives, but disillusioned with the church of their childhood?
Oh, I simply tell them to go with the spirituality. My sense is that religion, capital R, conventional, associated with an official denominational church, is a wonderful thing if it fits and if it works. But the fact that it doesn't fit and doesn't work should never keep someone from exploring, finding, and celebrating his or her own spiritual self. And for a lot of people, particularly for adults, it's a hard saying to deal with, because their fear is, at rock bottom, is that there is no religious affiliation, that they have by definition denied the spiritual affiliation. Now, their lived experience doesn't bear that out. I mean, they understand that they haven't gone to church for 10 years and they're still a very deeply spiritual person. But because religion goes in, as it were, for most of us, when we're so young, there is this really serious and deep-seated fear that if they let the external trappings go, that the internal isn't there. And so I just tend to be very, very supportive with them, in the sense of honoring and cherishing and celebrating how they look at the spiritual component of their lives, and finding support for that in terms of like-minded people, in terms of what they read, in terms of how they structure their days and their time, so that there's a space for reflection, for getting back to the core of who they are. And then, should that happen at some point in their lives, to coincide you know, with an institutional church, with conventional religion. That's wonderful, because there are some real positives to that in terms of having the rituals,
Right.
you know, and then the support, the community there. But should it not coincide, that's life. And one doesn't want to give up the strong spiritual component of oneself simply because there doesn't happen to be religion, capital R, that taps into it at a particular time.
Can you describe your role models, the persons who helped to form you as a person, a nun, and a college teacher?
Sure. Although interestingly, I'm not sure that they are separate in those three categories. I think what's happened is who I am as a person also happens to be a nun and happens to be a college teacher. I do know, for example, that the one very strong kind of generic set of role models I had were indeed the Adrian Dominican nuns who taught me when I was in elementary and secondary school. And the reason for that was in some ways not so much a religious reason. They were an incredibly strong set of models of strong females who had good minds and had stunning senses of humor. And I found that very attractive. I don't think that I thought about it consciously at the time. I mean, I wasn't a budding feminist, you know, thought, oh, this is great. But I know I was very impressed by the fact that these women had wonderful minds and used them all the time. And that was in rather sharp contrast, you know, to a lot of other females I knew who were wonderful people, but were not in a position where they were allowed to use their mind. And so I just found it very attractive to know that that was something that was available to me as a female, although I know I didn't consciously think of it at the time. That's more a retrospective, you know, kind of thing. I know that a very specific role model for me as a college teacher, and to some extent, maybe just as a thinking person, was a professor that I had at the University of Maryland on one of those wonderful National Science Foundation grants they had after Sputnik. We all got scared witless. I went off to College Park, Maryland, and did some wonderful math. And there was this professor, Dr. Thayer, whose favorite question in the math class, when we said to him, these were graduate students, when we said to him, but why, Dr. Thayer? He would say, why not? And it turned around completely my conception of mathematics. I mean, I was always good in math, but I thought math was a preordained universe. I thought we were discovering the laws of math. And what he got me to understand was that there was a raging battle in mathematics about whether we were discovering the laws or inventing them. And his ability to say, why not? To get us to look at completely consistent systems of mathematics that absolutely flew in the face of our lived experience of mathematics changed forever not only how I looked at math, but how I looked at learning in general. And so I know that influenced me just incredibly strongly. And then I think probably the other group of people I'd cite are kind of kind of a nameless group of people. And those are the people who question. I've always been very, very impressed by people who could ask good questions. You know how you're sitting in a lecture hall and you're listening to a really stunning lecture, and at the end the lecturer says, are there any questions? And everybody kind of goes, duh. And then someone in the back of the room asks this really stunning question. That's always been very impressive to me. In fact, I've always thought that probably the best thing colleges could do for new faculty members would be to give them maybe a 3/4 load and then send them off for their other quarter equivalency to sit in college classes for the sole purpose of asking good questions, so they could model to the students what it was like to hear those, because I think good questions are better caught than taught. And I know that I've gained tons from listening to people ask good questions over time, and that has influenced me very strongly, not only in terms of who I am as a teacher, it's clearly important there, and who I am as a person, but I think also who I am as a nun, because the notion of what I would call the critical believer is a real powerful notion for me. The fact that one can have very strong faith and still ask very good questions, and not have a contradiction between those two things. So there's a nameless, faceless band out there to whom I owe a great deal in that regard.
Folks in the back of the room.
Exactly, the Greek chorus.
The Greek chorus.
The Greek chorus of questioners.
Is she also a role model for you as a woman?
Definitely, definitely. I think a lot of times females tend to think that, oh, you know, I'm a girl. Even though they intellectually know that they are just as competent as boys are, I think they still kind of grow up thinking, well, I'm just a girl and I'll just do girl things. And even though they want to be president of the United States, they know they can't be. Whereas her, I wish she could be. And she can be, and she can do many things. So looking up to her as a woman who is very accomplished, very professional, as or more professional than any man I've known, is really a challenge to girls.
And somebody mentioned Sister Eileen Rice from Siena Heights to me, and I should go and see her. So I just popped into her office one day. I didn't even make an appointment, and she was there, which if you pop in there unannounced is not a very common thing to find her there, but she was there and she took her time, and within 1 hour she had me full of spirit. She had a full clear plan in my head, what I wanted, what I was going to do and how I had to get there. And I went in there being really lost and not knowing what to do, and I went home on cloud 9, and I was just it's hard to say, it's hard to describe in words. She just made this tremendous impact on me within 1 hour, never having seen her before, and she didn't know much about me, and she just put me full of spirits, and it's there and it's going to get me going.
She's very, very positive.
Sometimes I can even do some of Eileen's voice inflections and mannerisms. But
can you do one for us now?
Stunning. That is one of my favorites about Eileen. Must be stunning.
She's inspiring. You see her and you're just, it's exciting. Every time I'm around her, I can go to her office and be in just the worst mood, and then I'll leave and I'll be like, oh, flowers, trees, life. It's just great. I mean, it's kind of like, I'm early child. It's like a Disney movie, really. She's just one of those characters that'll live on forever. You know, she's just so neat.
Kind of a Mary Poppins almost, to think about it.
She sings sometimes in class too, so I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, Mary Poppins, spoonful of sugar.
I will never get a picture phone, because if people ever found out how much work I was doing while they were talking to me on the phone, they'd be real embarrassed.
They'd think you weren't listening to them.
I know it. We would not want that to be the case.
You missed your other calling as an actress.
Oh, listen, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it. Yes, indeed. Can you move the camera as I go?
Yeah.
All right.
Could not see any civilians in the town, although the troops were not allowed into any houses. The incident took place near the town of Valence, and the region where Muslims, Serbian, and Croatian battle lines diverged. UN sources say when the Swedes were taken captive, Swedish infantry and French foreign legions were
Okay.
She's always advertising free cats. She always has at least 3 cats in the office and a list of 25 more that need homes. She always has cat food in her purse. You know, she's always trying to pawn a cat off on someone.
Right.
And you know, cats are very much a part of her life, and she's very funny about them.
Yes. Well, I grew up with cats. My parents used to say that a stray cat could walk down the street, ignore every other house on the block, and turn unerringly into our walk. There must have been some sign, maybe roughly similar to the hobo sign, that says, "Suckers live here." So we always had tons of cats. It's just as part of how we grew up. Here at Siena, it is true that I've developed quite a reputation for that. At this count, we figure probably about 175 cats have found their home through my office in the last 7 years or so, roughly about 25 a year. I will admit the look on the faces of the parents of new freshmen is somewhat interesting. As they come into a college office, the last thing they expect to see is a cat there. However, many of them have taken the cat home. In fact, Bob Gordon, our dean, is quite wonderful. When we do freshman orientation, it's typically done in this building. He will often come into my office, look to see what the resident cat is, throw it over his shoulder, walk into the room where he's about to address the parents, and say, "Hey, you give us a kid, we give you a cat." Maybe a cat has gone home under those circumstances.
When she called me on the phone, I among a number of other people, to tell me that the cancer had recurred. She did it in this sort of very objective way, as though she were reading a menu. But coupled with that was the very personal contact of, like, I want to tell you, and inviting me as well as some other people here today. Again, it's one of those paradoxes, I think, with Eileen, that the both things seems to exist simultaneously. So I think I just have to take a minute with my own feelings about the situation. I guess to say that she's a real gift around here. And gifts change shapes over over time and into eternity, so that her gift will never be lost to us. Her presence will always be here, but it doesn't diminish the loss.
Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, talked about the prospect of death as something which concentrates the mind. What have you learned from the experience thus far? What do you now see as important?
Well, I think probably really what I see as important is a variation of what I said a minute ago, that every day does matter. And that the important thing is to really, I suppose, seize the moment sounds a little bit greedy, you know, but to really kind of relish and celebrate, you know, what is right now. And that's made a big difference to me. It has in my whole life. That's kind of part of who I am as a person. And the fact that, as you said, the doctors are, I really don't have very long to live, doesn't change how I look at each day, in the sense it doesn't make me more anxious. I don't have the sense that if I don't get this done, or I don't talk to that person, that everything won't be all right. I just figure, you know, whatever happens today, that's what's supposed to happen. Now, I've teased a lot of my friends because I've been very upfront with this. I mean, all my students know what my situation is. I've made sure all my former students knew, because I thought it wasn't fair, you know, to have something like this happen and have them be unaware of it. And so people have been just wonderful, and they call up, each one wanting to, this is not funny, wanting to take me out for the Last Supper. And it's been just wonderful. I mean, if I don't gain 20 pounds through this, it won't be for lack of trying. And so I've had this wonderful opportunity, you know, to kind of spend really quality time with everybody. I mean, not many people have the situation I do, where I knew this far ahead, you know, about a year ahead, what my situation was. But I feel so good that it's not like I'm curled up in a hospital bed somewhere. So I can go on, do my thing, have wonderful time with people, but have the time to say all the stuff we want to say to each other. And that's just an incredible gift, an absolutely incredible gift. And so that's kind of my biggest experience of all of this. I mean, yes, the prospect of dying does concentrate the mind, but in my case, it's been able to concentrate it real positively, because folks have been able to say to me, and I've been able to say to them, the things that typically people say, oh crud, I wish I told her. You know? In fact, one of my students wrote and said, oh, Eileen, can't we have the wake ahead of time so you can hear all the nice stuff before I say? I thought, well, how nice. I mean, a little embarrassing, but what a nice thought.
Every day of my life that I continue to teach, you know, elementary school students, you know, I will always remember her. She has been my hero.
I was teaching my first semester, and I had a class that started at 8:35 at night, and we were doing a videotape sales presentation. The student assistant didn't show up, and so I ran over to the offices hoping to make a call and see if I could find someone to do the taping. I was naturally kind of frantic. Eileen came out, and as she's inclined to do, can I help? And I explained the situation. She said, oh, no problem, I'll run it for you. So she ran the cameras while I did the session. And I was determined, you know, that I was going to pay her back someday, and that was very difficult because she's a very resourceful person and self-sufficient, and I just never could. And then it dawned on me that I wasn't supposed to pay Eileen back. I was supposed to pay her back by helping other people. And I mentioned that to her, and she said, you got it.
I would have to say, Eileen, that there has not been one single person in my life who has had as much impact on me as a person and who I am to become as you have. And for that, I thank you.
Maybe if there's a proverb for what you've been saying, it would be attitude is destiny.
Oh, there you go. There you go. I think there's a great deal to be said for that. Yes. Yes, I like that.
I had a student who named a star in honor of me, but never told me that he did it. And when he signed the card, he had the company to sign it with the asterisk with the star on it. It took me 2 weeks to get the company to release his name, to tell him where it came from. So there's some star out there somewhere that has my name on it. And I have a certificate to prove it. I think it's wonderful. Yeah.